But right out of the gate, a major challenge in the journey to the mountain for any Arabian mountain candidate is the wilderness of Shur.
Then Moses made Israel set out from Yam Suf, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water.
Shur was the first wilderness entered immediately after the miraculous sea crossing. So Shur and the sea crossing go together. But almost all Bible maps and encyclopedias put Shur near Egypt, mainly because the sea crossing is thought to be near Egypt. So Shur is used as a trump card to say the crossing and Mount Sinai must be near Egypt and not Arabia.
So this is a map of the Gulf of Aqaba here.
Yes, we want to look at how the Hebrews might have arrived at the mountain. And in earlier discussions, we talked about a crossing from the Nuweiba area across Yam Suf and an exit here at Wadi al-Hasha, which is a very navigable wadi going uphill from the coast.
We were on this wadi, and it's quite wide.
It's very wide, and the beachhead is very wide.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, this is a view of that beachhead over towards Nuweiba on this side across the sea, and this is the beachhead that would have been the landing site if the crossing occurred in this location. And this is looking up Wadi al-Hasha. This is the narrowest point in the wadi right up in here, and it's a couple hundred yards wide, but it's the narrowest point. Reading in Exodus 15:22, so Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, Yam Suf. Then they went into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. We're going to be looking at this particular part of the route leaving the sea, and this involves the wilderness of Shur. Having exited the sea at this point, we'll be looking at the initial part of the route through the wilderness of Shur. And some people might ask, why didn't the route go straight from the sea to the mountain? And there's three main reasons. The terrain is inaccessible between this area of the coast and the area of the mountain.
And then the Bible says there were some campsites too.
That's right. There were 8 places in between the sea crossing and reaching the wilderness of Sinai. So we have to account for 8 places in the route and 40 days of travel, because I estimate that they arrived at the far shore of the sea about 20 days from leaving Egypt. And they arrived down here, which will be the wilderness of Sin, at about 30 days from Egypt. So that means it was 10 days from the sea to this point, and then it was a month from the wilderness of Sin over to the wilderness of Sinai. So there were 40 days of travel approximately in the northwest Arabian area to get from the sea to the mountain.
So the wilderness of Sin means the wilderness of the east.
Yes.
And the wilderness of Sinai means the wilderness of the far east.
Yes.
Further than the wilderness of the east.
Yes. And when we say wilderness of east, or the east wilderness, that means east of this landmark, which was the Gulf of Aqaba, which was the previous farthest east landmark that Moses used when he had been in Egypt. Now that he's on the east side of that landmark, that's no longer useful for points farther east.
Yeah.
And to review, the wilderness of Shur was entered, and they spent 3 days in this wilderness of Shur. Why was it called the wilderness of Shur? There's a mountain range between the Dead Sea and the head of the Gulf that's been called Mount Seir. It was the place of the Horites. It was the land of Edom, established by Esau. Now it's the mountains of modern western Jordan. But this word Shur means wall. And when you approach these mountains from the west, that looks like a wall, and it literally is a wall as far as navigating, and there's only a few passages through that wall.
I've actually, been through this area at different times, and it is a wall. And you have to work your way down through it, at a specific location. Otherwise, you're traveling up on top. And this is Jordan in here.
Yes.
And Petra's over here.
If this mountain range was the wall, called Shur in Hebrew. Then the extension of that along the seacoast of Yam Suf was referred to by Moses as the wilderness of Shur. So it's a very simplistic idea, but it makes sense because this didn't act as a wall to commerce. Only the northern part actually acted as a barrier to commerce. Once you got along the sea, it was a landscape feature, but it wasn't a barrier to land travel. So it was just the wilderness of Shur, the tail end of Shur.
So this area of Edom is this sloping area around the sea.
It's the land sloping to the sea, correct. The 3 days travel after the sea crossing is described in two ways: the wilderness of Shur or the wilderness of Edom. And Edom refers to the low-lying land that slopes to the sea, and it therefore can surround the entire head of the Gulf, and it refers again to essentially the coastland. The wilderness of Edom would be the heavier terrain behind the actual coastline. And these two terms were both used describing the 3 days of travel after the sea crossing. Looking more closely at the route from the sea, here's Wadi al-Hasha.
So what we have here is this is the crossing,
Gulf
and you're
of
saying
Aqaba.
so the Israelites would have come out of this area
Yes.
into this.
And they begin climbing this wide open wadi, and for 17 miles they climb uphill to an altitude of about 3,500 feet. And at that point, the descent begins, and the reason they're descending is they're looking for water. You don't find water at high elevations, you find water at low elevations. They're climbing to get away from the seacoast, but in climbing, their chances of finding water start to decrease as the elevation increases. But they begin to decrease elevation as they turn south to gain entry to the Wadi al-Afal, which is the main north-south wadi in northwest Arabia. Wadi al-Afal means the Wadi of the Groove, and it is basically a very large groove that passes north-south in this area of northwest Arabia and Midian. The first 17 miles were spent reaching this elevation. When they joined Wadi Afal, they were at 24 miles from the sea. Tim, looking at this route, someone might ask, well, why did they turn south to begin the route to the mountain? They turned south because Moses had lived here for 40 years, and he was looking for water. And he knew that if he got to lower elevations, he would have a better chance to find water. And he also probably knew that these oasis locations did have water. So his intent from this sea crossing was to move south, move to lower elevations as quickly as possible to get to the areas that he knew had water. From then, the routes rely on natural corridors and historical travel routes. And I placed the first encampment that's named Mara at 34 miles from the sea. And there's several reasons for that. First of all, it says that they traveled 3 days and then they came to Mara. 3 days travel would be 11 or 12 miles a day, much of it uphill, all of it without adequate water. So they were moving relatively slowly.
They would have had to have transported some water then, obviously, to get them to this location.
Yes, they used their large animals as beast of burdens to carry water bags, but at a certain point they're going to run out if they don't have refreshment.
Well, do you think that when you call this Mara, why do you think is there a water source in this area?
There are several reasons. Musil, who explored this area in 1910, cited an area over here called Jebel Musa, and it's spelled differently than Mara, and the meaning may be different, but you have the sound of the word in this general area. Then the explorer Burton in 1878 mentioned a place in Wadi Afal in this area called Marak. Now Marak means salt. Mara means bitter. So you may have some connection there with the sound of the word and the meanings that would indicate a historical occurrence of bad water or salty water, bitter water in this particular area.
Is it a big enough area that people could have encamped, and are there people living in this area now?
it's a fairly large part of the wadi, a wide area of the wadi, and you can see several wadis joining into one place here. Here's a picture of the wadi just north of there, so you can see how flat and wide some of these areas are. The satellite image shows multiple wadis emptying into this general area. So if there's going to be a place where there is water that's pooled, this would give you a better chance to see that with all of the drainages ending at this point.
So it says, now they came to Mara. They could not drink the waters of Mara, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Mara.
Right. And even though the water was bitter and required a miracle to change it to drinkable water, there still was water there in quantities that would meet the needs of this tremendous multitude after 3 days of travel without water.
I think this is what has been such a challenge for people, is when you think about that many people in the desert without water. I mean, it just shuts you down to believe that it's possible for a lot of people.
And think of the wide access to water that would be required to meet the needs of 500,000 head of cattle and hundreds of thousands of people. It would have to be a very large area that had the water, not some little small brook or waterfall. It would need to provide access surface area wise and interface wise for the large number of people.
Yeah.
And that's what we have here, is we have a large flat area fed by potential drainages. Looking at a modern map,
And as you said, that geologically it was more arid, but there's more vegetation in this area.
well, the region would be arid, but this would be a collection point for drainage and would potentially hold water under the right climate conditions or weather conditions. On a modern map, the highway passing through this Mara area is built on a number of bridges. We see bridges, numerous bridges. These indicate to us that even today there is water flow, water settling, standing water that would affect the highway if they hadn't built it on bridges. So there's a suspicion, even with the bridge requirements here, that this is a collection point for water. And again, I'm basing this on also the mileage from the sea, 34 miles from the sea, and the 3 days in travel. This is a guess, it's just an educated guess, but we have to stop the Hebrews somewhere within a reasonable 3-day travel from the sea, calculating for the type of terrain that they're traversing and their water shortage. After Mara, they came to a limb where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, so they camped there by the waters. We're going to focus on this area of the route, and we're going to look at the area of Elim. I place that in the region of Al-Bad, the modern town of Al-Bad, for the reason that there has been characteristically a lot of water available and a lot of vegetation, specifically palm trees.
And what you're saying then is that they crossed here at Aqaba, then they came to their first campsite at Mara. The second campsite would have come down here to Elim.
Elim,
Which
correct.
is what you're suggesting is modern day.
In the region of modern day Al-Bad. Looking more closely at this map, the Wadi of Fall flows through Al-Bad, and it would have been the main water source under the right climate conditions for water flow through Al-Bad. I estimate that Elim would have been in the lower reaches of this wadi in the vicinity of Al-Bad. But in addition, Tim, this wadi called Wadi al-Hamd, which flows to the sea here at Makna, also had a lot of water and a lot of vegetation, as it does in modern times. It seems reasonable to me that people searching for water, spreading out, looking to pasture, came into this northern, western part of Wadi al-Hamd from the Al-Bad area and also pastured in here. And so I would say Elim was an entire region here involving...
So these green areas here are suggestive of more of a fertile area that water is in.
Yes, I estimate this entire area to have been Elim, the lower part of Wadi Afal at Al-Bad, and also this region of Wadi al-Hamt. Some people have recently suggested that this little oasis up in Wadi Taib al-Ism was Elim. You can see the tremendous size difference between this area and this small little oasis. This is a problem to call Elim because it's boxed in. There's no way to exit this at the sea and to move anywhere. It's a very narrow canyon and there's no seashore at the outlet of this wadi.
Is this where Andrew Jones has been filming? Is that the location?
Yes, and also Dr. Kim, I believe, favors this area as Elim. The problem with this is that the routes leading to this come from these highland mountain areas. They're more difficult tracks than Wadi al-Afal. And then the real problem is getting to the sea encampment, which follows Elim from this oasis, because there are no southern routes that would be traversable at the time of the Exodus for a multitude. So if you did get people in this area, first of all, they wouldn't fit because there's not enough area there. It's essentially a dead end. Then you wouldn't be able to get them out for the next encampment, which is Yam Suf along the sea.
Yeah, so what you're basically suggesting is they come up through the highland, they come through here to Mara, they work their way to Elim, and then they head to the sea.
Yes. Before we talk about the sea, I want to show this map in Wadi al-Hamt. This is a modern topographical map in the area that I surmise may have been Elim. And you can see all of these black dots, which represent cisterns. Some are labeled and some aren't. But this wadi area is an agricultural area now, and there's a lot of water resources that allow the agriculture to take place.
I see cisterns all through here. And a cistern would it be called a well?
Would be a holding tank, a shallow well, a storage tank. I don't know how tightly these terms are defined, but the idea is that there is water to harvest or to store in this area of the wadi.
As I experienced being in the mountains when a rainstorm came, that all the water pours down. And even in Jerusalem, the way it was created was that they would have places to capture water. And so if these mountains were rained upon, these cisterns then would be a catch basin, right, for all the water?
Yes, they would potentially take advantage of naturally low points, collection points, and line it with rock and water impervious materials to save the water. So that would be water harvesting, but also there may have been shallow wells in these areas that are represented by the cisterns.
One of the things that I have noticed myself being in the wilderness, traveling and looking for the routes of the Exodus, is that water is so critical. And so as you're looking at these paths from a geographical standpoint, you're looking for, is the path wide enough for this many people, and then where would they get water?
Exactly. Water is the determinant for civilization. And in archaeology, if you're looking for an ancient Indian encampment, an ancient location, the first thing you have to do is to look at the potential water resources. And that certainly is a part of the Exodus, and that's why I show this map in Wadi Hamt. Numbers 33:10 states that they moved from Elim and camped by the Red Sea, which is Yam Suf. This particular encampment is only mentioned in Numbers. It's not mentioned in Exodus. And I believe the reason it's only mentioned in Numbers and not in the Exodus account of the route is because the entire contingency of the congregation did not go to the sea. There were disadvantages to going all the way to the sea. First of all, a lack of fresh water. There's no fresh water available from the sea. And in the case of this area of ancient Machna, there's limited room for encampment. My hunch is that a lot of the congregation stayed at these pasturing areas of Elim, and a contingency bled over to the seacoast and camped at Yam Suf. And I have an X here to remind me that the exit from this surmised location of Elim at the oasis of Wadi Tayyib al-Izm goes nowhere. There's no path along the mountains. They drop into the sea, and so exit from this point to the sea is not an option for the time of the Exodus. And by the way, Tayyib al-Izm means of the good name. This would be Valley of the Good Name. It's named for the mountain of the same name, which lies here, the mountain of the good name.
Why is it the fact that it's not mentioned in both scriptures and it's only mentioned in one?
My understanding would be that only part of the congregation went to the sea. The entire congregation did not visit the sea, so it's mentioned, but it's not highlighted in the way the scriptures record it. We want to hearken back to the sea crossing because we're at the sea and recall the demise of the Egyptian army.
So you got a scripture verse here?
Yes, Exodus 15 reads, Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in Yam Suf. The depths have covered them. They sank to the bottom like a stone. You blew with your wind. The sea covered them, and they sank like lead in the mighty waters. So we have a description of drowning of a huge number of men and horses in a sea with mighty water. And when they drowned, they sank like a stone. They sank like lead. I bring this up because the Hebrews are camped at Yam Suf. The route has led them to this area.
And this was always a puzzle too, because it says that they were, they crossed Yam Suf and then they came back again and camped at Yam Suf. And that would be puzzling if you're at a near Egypt location, because a near Egypt location, you'd be right back at the lakes, wouldn't you?
Yes, and it's difficult to explain with a small body of water that you cross, and then sometime later, a week, 10 days or more, you again come back to that same little body of water. And the idea would be that they traveled in circles. They were confused or lost, but that was not the case. They were being led by a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud.
So with a longer body of water like the Gulf of Aqaba, which if it is the biblical Yam Suf, which you've been building a case that it is, they would have come up through here and, as you're saying, come around and then camped again at this location.
Yes, and I estimate about 7 days of travel between the crossing and the return to the sea at this point. This is about 39 miles south of the crossing point.
So what happened at this location that takes notice? Why were they at the sea, do you think?
I bring up the demise of the Egyptian army because this would have been the drowning area here. The Bible says that they sunk like lead, they sunk like stones, they went to the bottom. Now, in Exodus, Moses recorded that after the crossing, they did see Egyptians dead on the shore. But then these verses indicate that they sunk like lead and like stones, so a lot of them did not show up on the shore. And we have to say, well, what happened to those that sunk like lead or like stones? Even though it's 2,800 feet deep in the deepest part, the Gulf of Aqaba is an interesting body of water, an unusual body of water, because it doesn't have thermoclines. Thermoclines would be layers of different temperatures of water, normally that would get colder as you go deeper.
Why wouldn't that be there? Because I know, like, even in the lake here in Minnesota, you can feel the thermoclines within feet,
Part of it has to do with the warm climate, the lack of water inflow to the Gulf, circulation of the Gulf water from the Red Sea, the circulation patterns, but also the water is so deep that at the very bottom, there's a process that occurs where the weight of the overlying water creates heat in the water molecules at the bottom. So there's actually heat being generated in these deep parts of the Gulf of Aqaba.
And some people might not realize how deep it is. It's almost a mile deep, isn't it?
Well, at the midpoint of the anticipated crossing site, it's 2,800 feet, which would be close to half a mile.
Yeah, but in these areas, it's even deeper.
Yes, it's much deeper. But at the point of the drowning, we have the army sinking like lead to the bottom, but because of the lack of thermoclines, we have warm waters at the bottom of this sea. And what happens when a creature drowns is, if the water's warm enough, the bacteria starts to grow and putrefaction occurs, and then gases are created from the putrefaction that causes bloating.
So if Pharaoh's horses and his charioteers and his army were all cast into the sea here, there'd be hundreds, thousands of bodies, right?
Yes. And at some point in time, they're going to begin to bloat because of the warm water. When they bloat, they're going to float to the surface. It just so happens that in the Gulf of Aqaba, the prevailing wind is due north. So anything that came to the surface in the area of the debacle would be driven to the south by the winds.
So if the bodies of the Egyptian charioteers and Pharaoh's army, they would be floating and being blown in this direction, is what you're saying?
Yes. And as I indicated moments ago, I anticipate that it was a 7-day trip from the crossing to the seashore for the Hebrews. That would give time for bodies to surface, the wind to drift, and the likely place for them to land would be on the slanted shore here in the area of the encampment at Machna.
Did anything happen specifically at that location the Bible speaks about?
Well, the Bible doesn't mention this particular event, but Josephus, the historian, does. And what I want to first point out are the temperature characteristics in this area of the crossing site. At the 850 meter depth of the Nuweiba Passage, which would be 2,800 feet, going over on this temperature curve, the average temperature would be 24 degrees centigrade, which is about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Water is warm enough to allow putrefaction to begin and the bloating to occur. As the depth decreases and comes closer to the surface, the water temperatures even increase more. So bodies that were in the shallower areas would even have warmer temperatures up to 82 degrees underwater for the putrefaction to occur. And so the conditions with the unique temperatures in the Gulf of Aqaba and the prevailing wind conditions could combine to bring the remains of the army to these shores.
Because I know the Bible is stating that the bodies were on the shore up here, of some of them, right after the event happened, right after the sea closed.
Yes, they saw the dead on the shore.
Yep.
But then a few verses later, we read that they sunk like lead, they sunk like stone. So a good portion of them probably covered with armor, carrying swords, horses harnessed to chariots, other things weighting the animals and the men down would aid their sinking.
And then this decay would happen, and then they would bloat and become like balloons.
Right, and float to the surface. And it's gory to talk about, but we have to realize that this was a major demise of tens of thousands of horses and men, and something happened to them.
Well, let's just say in war, like in World War II, often we've seen newsreel footage of, ships that were sunk at sea, and then the bodies that were blown up, that were washed ashore.
Yes, and in shallower water, warmer waters, that would occur. Deeper waters where they're thermoclines, they just continue to sink and they never surface because they're essentially refrigerated.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this event is an entry by Josephus, who was the 1st century AD historian, a Jewish historian. And he wrote, "On the next day, Moses gathered together the weapons of the Egyptians, which were brought to the camp of the Hebrews by the current of the sea and the force of the winds resisting it." This is exactly what we're describing here.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that is very interesting.
It's amazing the way he describes this. He, meaning Moses, conjectured that this also happened by divine providence so that they might not be destitute of weapons.
Because they were slaves, they wouldn't have left with any weapons.
There's no accounting of having left Egypt with weapons. They did get gifts and jewelry from the Egyptians. That's recorded. But
some people say, though, that they left armed, that the Hebrew says that they left armed, but did the Hebrew actually mean that they were armed?
I don't know that the verse really says armed. I think it indicates that they left in ranks, in some sort of order. And the word that's used there refers to military formations.
Yes, and Moses, if he would have been trained as a prince of Egypt, he would have probably organized the tribes.
Yes, I think he realized early on he had to have some type of delegated authority, and organization.
Okay, so we go back to the fact that what Josephus is saying, this is just startling to me because of what you're finding here. There is a real interesting pattern of how this could all come together.
It's very interesting, and the divine providence side of it is interesting to me because we already have a tremendous miracle of the sea parting, the rescue of the Hebrews through the sea and the destruction of this army in the sea. Now we have another miracle. We have the army of Egypt carries all of their weapons and metals, gold, silver, bronze, brass, maybe some iron, usable harnesses and wheels and other hardware appliances, bring them all the way across the Sinai Peninsula, all the way to the sea for the Hebrews to pick up later in their journey where they haven't had to transport any of it. And so when Moses had ordered the Hebrews to arm themselves with them, he led them to Mount Sinai. So I want to point out a little chronology thing here that sometimes Josephus abridges the Hebrew Bible account. He says that they went from arming themselves here to Mount Sinai. He leaves out a lot of detail. Likewise, he puts this event on the next day, referring to the day after the sea crossing. So the chronology that Josephus has leaves a little bit to be desired as far as potential accuracy. But I don't think that the Hebrews remained on the shore of the sea for a whole day after they left the sea. I think they would have started immediately moving inland, and that this is just a chronology issue with Josephus. On the next day this happened, and then immediately they went to Mount Sinai.
So some people could say, well, this all happened up here, right?
It could have, except that contradicts the biblical account that they sunk like lead, they sunk like stones. They did see some dead on the shore, but the other account says the army sunk like stones and lead. So we know that the whole army wasn't on the shore, and we know that some number of them went to the bottom.
But I get what the point is what you're making is that this would have been the remains of the army coming over this direction.
Yes, discovered about 7 days after the sea crossing. And there would have been no other reason really to come to the shore other than perhaps divine providence to pillage and harvest from the remaining parts of the army. Reviewing here, Elim involved the areas around Al-Bad and the Wadi Hamt, and then the movement continued in Wadi Hamt to Machna, to the Yam Suf encampment, where the weapons were harvested from the remaining army here on the shore.
Where do you think they went from the sea then after that?
The Bible says they went to the wilderness of Sin. Specifically, Numbers 33:11 says they moved from the Red Sea, or Yam Suf, and camped in the wilderness of Sin.
And then I like this. Well, now that I know that Sin is the wilderness of the east, or the wilderness of east.
Yes, and it's east of Yam Suf, directly east of Yam Suf. I place the wilderness of Sin in this coastal plain south of Al-Bad, and it's the drainage area, the outflow area of Wadi al-Afal, the river of Midian, the river of northwest Arabia. And then it has all these tributaries coming in, and there were places that had water in these tributaries. There's even a town of Asila here today that's a little agricultural town. I estimate that the Hebrews followed the wadi beds to the south into the wilderness of Sin. And
a wadi means?
Wadi is Arabic for valley. This is a picture of the terrain of the wilderness of Sin near the head of the Red Sea, and you can see how flat it is and now how desiccated the terrain also is. Exodus 16 gives us a more detailed account. It says, they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came into the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. This tells me a couple of things geographically. First of all, the wilderness of Sin was large enough to allow all the congregation to enter at one time and be in one place at one time. And if you're thinking about a couple million people and their herds, you're talking about many square miles that would have to be suitable as far as terrain to accommodate that number of people.
Yeah, because that is telling you that possibly that not all the congregation were able to be at some of those campsites. They might have been out further away.
Exactly, because there's only 2 times when it's mentioned that they were all in one place. Here, and then at Mount Hor, later in the Exodus, it says that the entire congregation came to Mount Hor. So we know it has to be a big area based on that description. And then when they left Elim a chapter later, it said the same thing again, that the entire congregation, all the congregation left the wilderness of Sin. And it's between Elim and Sinai. So this means that
Here's Elim, right?
Elim, this is on the road, the only route to Sinai. You had to go through the wilderness of Sin to get to Sinai, because this lies between the 2 locations.
And when it says Sinai, does that mean the mountain, Mount Sinai?
It might refer to the mountain, or it might refer to the wilderness of Sinai, but again, we're talking about a general location far to the east. In other words, to get far to the east, Sinai, the east of the east,
right.
This was on the route to get there.
So here's the big difference I think I'm seeing, is that as you look at the Hebrew approach moves you constantly further east and east, whereas a more near Egypt approach pushes everything close to Egypt.
Yes, it piles events on top of places close together near Egypt, and then if the mountain is placed in the southern peninsula, then the people move generally south or southeast.
Because I think a lot of understanding, well, I don't think there has been a lot of understanding, put it that way, about the fact that it kept saying that these locations were east of the Gulf of Aqaba.
Yes, I think just the definitions of Sin and Sinai as east and far east gives you pause to think about what Moses is trying to describe, east or far east of what. And we've already mentioned that Yam Suf was a key landmark because it was the boundary of the Promised Land. And there's a chronology phrase. They entered on the 15th day of the 2nd month. So they left Egypt on the 15th day of the 1st month. They arrive here the 15th day of the 2nd month.
So 30 days?
Took them a month. I estimate that the sea was crossed within 20 days of leaving Goshen in Egypt. And therefore that gave them about 10 days to travel from the sea crossing to arrive in the wilderness of Sin.
Whereas if you have a near Egypt approach, that crossing took place in the 3rd day.
Yes, it would be very compressed. Now, the other thing that's notable about the wilderness of Sin is this began the daily feeding of manna, and also they were fed quails. The Bible says that the quails flew in low around the camp, and they were able to catch them and harvest them and have quail in the wilderness of Sin. It's interesting that the migration of birds from Africa to Europe in the spring, in the months of March and April, which would coincide with the Exodus period, follows the western coast of the Red Sea. They pass over the head of the Red Sea, and then the route is constricted here because this is where the birds land and rest. They've flown over this northern part of the Red Sea. Now they have to refuel and rest, and that's why it's constricted in this area. This red dot represents the location we're looking at for the wilderness of Sin. This bird migration pattern, although it's not specifically for quails, is indicative of many birds that follow this route at this time of year, and it would explain why the birds would be prevalent at that area of the Arabian Peninsula to be able to be caught around the camps.
Yeah, so you can see there's quite a concentration, I guess, right in this area here.
Yeah, it's like an hourglass. This is a very simple map, but it gives a lot of explanation to the Bible's description of quail coming into the camp in the wilderness of Sin. And the time of the year also coincides. the migration time coincides. We've entered the wilderness of Sin. From the coast here, it's 76 miles to the middle of the wilderness of Sin. For those who didn't make the detour to the seaside encampment. And again, people are going to say, well, why are they going way around in a circuitous route? Why not just go to the mountain? Why are they heading so far away from the mountain? You can't get there because of the terrain.
Yeah, it's, I mean, after being there, I know that.
Yes, and so we have to keep that in mind, that this looks like a circuitous route, but the options to go elsewhere were not available.